Well, good day, everybody. Welcome to December 28th. We have a couple more days left in the year 2018, don't we? One of the questions that one of you guys asked me is, can I expound a little bit more on the subject of my writing process, especially pertaining to this cold hard type, crowdsourced typewriter-themed fiction short story project of Dr. Richard Polt's. And a lot of you I know in the typosphere are engaged in writing your stories at this moment. So I'd like to talk a little bit about my writing process and some tips for working it out on a typewriter. So stay tuned. Well, the first thing I should point out is that there is no one correct way to write. Everybody needs to find their own process. But that being said, if you're just starting your writing career or your writing adventure, as it really is, maybe you don't know which way you should start. What are the common ways of working on a rough draft, or how do you start writing? What are some of the tips? I can give you certainly some ideas from my own experience. Well, for your first draft, for putting ideas down, just the rough sketch ideas of what you want to do with your story, or just brainstorm ideas maybe, there's nothing wrong with handwriting, obviously. I know this is a typewritten story project, but the typewriting is the final output. Instead of the final output being mechanically or digitally printed, it's actually going to be typewritten as a final output. But you could use the typewriter for the entire process, from the earliest brainstorming of notes all the way through. But you could also do handwriting. Now, one of the common ways that I've enjoyed doing story writing in the past is I love using composition books. And I have a whole series of composition books that I've filled up and I collect. One of the things I noted after I did a composition book writing for a few years is, because of the nature of composition books, they're stitched. They're bound permanently, or at least intended to be bound permanently, and the binding is a stitched binding. So some people do rip pages out of composition books, but I usually cringe when that happens because, you know, the manufacturer goes to the trouble of having these nice cloth stitches. So I don't rip the pages out of composition books, and because of that, it is a serial data collection. Serial meaning there is a certain order the pages go, and you can't reorder them after the fact. So if you're writing for a bunch of different ideas from one day to the next, maybe you're doing journal entry, maybe you're doing daily note taking, maybe you're also writing notes for short stories, you're going to have a jumble of different topics and themes in the composition book. So the way some people get around that is they might have several composition books based on the subject matter, like one composition book just for their story project. Because of that, the idea that composition books and hardbound journal books in general kind of lock the pages into a certain order, I started using a binder like this a few years ago. There's a little clip for a legal pad. The nice thing about this system is individual sheets, you can pull them out, and then you can 3-hole punch and stick these pages in whatever binding system, like a 3-ring binder that you want to use. And so now you have random access, in a sense, because now each of these pages can be pulled out and randomly reordered in their own theme, their own subject, their own binders or whatever. So that's the way I kind of like to use handwritten note-taking for these story projects up front. But there's other ways to do it. Another way to write your brainstorming, your early phases of your writing project, is to get one of these Alpha Smart Neos. They are, of course, digital, but they're dedicated just to word processing, and you can interface them via a USB cable to your computer and import them into a word processor. Now, in the context of this cold hard type story writing project, it's still possible to use this. Obviously, the final version is going to be typewritten on paper, but you can use this, one of these, or even a laptop computer, any kind of a digital word processing or text editor kind of technology. You can use it, of course, for your rough draft, your story ideas and all that, but I really think there's going to be a place where you really need to sit down and put it down on paper, either by hand or typed in a rough draft. So that's basically what you got to start, is get those notes down on paper somehow. I'm putting all my notes and stuff in just a binder, a folder, but what I do right up at the very first page of the folder is I have a printout of Richard Polt's email with all the details of the formatting of the finished piece and some of the notes he has about some of the things to think about on writing your story. Then we get into some early first draft writing. Now, the background I have in short story writing is I've written a number of stories in the past that involve this imaginary world centered around a coffee shop known as Loser's Blend. And it's loosely inspired by a little bit of William Gibson's science fiction. It's also kind of loosely based on a city, kind of like Albuquerque, but a little bit more urban. I sat down back in November, early November, and I wrote out this idea that I had. And I kind of just had an idea one day for a story. It was more of a vignette. This is just a 2-page vignette. Not even enough to be a short story. And it's just about this character named Petrus, who is living in a little rural area in New Mexico, living in a cabin. He's hiding out from these guys, the high-tech world, the government, I guess, and they attack him. They attack his site, and he has to leave and figure out how to get out of that mess. It's just like one little scene out of an action movie, if you can think of that, a vignette. This may or may not have had anything to do with the actual final story of my submission for the Cold Hard Type project, but it was a kind of just a vignette that I was inspired to write for no other reason than it just came to me. So my first recommendation is, to be a writer, we have to be writing. You have to always be writing, thinking about stories. So it comes early December, and I'm starting to get more serious about Cold Hard Type. I had written some detailed descriptions of this world that the story was going to take place in. And so I really would advise you to think about what kind of a world is it. Now, fortunately, Richard Polt gave us some tips and hints in one of his emails about what are the things to think about your world and when you're writing it. But I think before you create a character, you have to think about the world and the details of that world. And so I had to go through several revisions of this. Like this particular whole detail of this world, hardly anything of this is what I actually used in my actual story. But this was just one version of a possible world where the story takes place. Then I had on December 16th, I believe, December 16th, I got closer to where I think the story needed to go. What I was wanting to do is in my case, I wanted to write about the very start of the collapse of the digital age, and there is already a underground typewriter movement involved, and something happens to precipitate the collapse. You have to think about logically, if you're creating this world and this collapse happens, it has to make sense from what we know in the real world. It has to make some kind of sense. So that's the important thing, is you do have to think about that. Think of all the little angles, right? So anyway, December 16th, I had another idea for a background world that the story would take place in, and it seemed a little more plausible. And then on the December 19th, I did more typing on the thermal typewriter. Look at that. And I got even closer, more details about what's happening in that world. And I was specifically, in this case, guided by these 8 questions that Richard Polt had asked. What happened to the digital world? Why can humans no longer use computers and the internet? How widespread or uniform is the collapse? How does the lack of digital technology affect society? What's the scope of the story? Does the society resemble any real place or era in history? Why are typewriters useful in the context of the story? Why would people return to them? How do the typewriters keep running? You have to think about maintenance, ribbons, etc. And remember, most important of all, remember the story is always about people. And that's what it comes down to, is always about people. So I attempted in this long thing, I attempted to answer all 8 of those questions. And it was really what I did here in this process. It was brainstorming. I would take each one of these questions, think about what I'd already written in the previous answers, and then come up with something that kind of builds this world up. So in my preparation for beginning to write, I finally, on December 23rd, I finally write this long piece on 8.5-inch wide thermal paper that is the final summary of the world that my fictional story will take place in, including the name of the organization, which is, they call themselves Unalog, which is underground analog. Basically, I've kind of tried to answer all the questions of why and how and all that. So at this point, once I had finished writing the whole background of the world that the story takes place in, then I had to sit down and actually start writing. And the first thing I had to do is I really had to create a character. What kind of a character was it? You know, I was kind of like inspired by some of my past writings, but also I wanted to be different. And so I came up with this character named Marie. What I did with my story, I basically sat down and just wrote it as a first draft, keeping in mind all of the things that I've been establishing in these previous weeks about where my world was, what the world was of this fictional story. And keeping that in mind, having studied this and gone through several revisions, I knew what this world was like now. So that would inform me when I started to sit down and write. It kind of just poured out. What I wanted to do with the actual story, I didn't want the arc of the story to take place over a long period of time, like an epic kind of a thing. I wanted it to be short and succinct, taking place over a period of maybe a few weeks only. In the big picture, I've started by creating this entire world, creating an explanation for what happened that got the world from where we're at currently to where it's at, and then explaining all the details of kind of background stuff, well, the political setting and the economics and who are the underground people and how do they sustain the typewriters, etc., etc. What's their motivation? All of that informs the character, right? Now when I'm actually writing the story, it's about the character. I'm walking in the character's shoes. What motivates the character? And you really have to make the character to be a person that the audience would care about and enjoy reading about. They have to have something invested in the character themselves. You want the character to be likable in a sense. You want the audience to be interested in the story, and the character draws the audience in the story. I wrote my first draft on a typewriter. Then I waited a few days or a week, and I sat down and then I redline edited the draft and made corrections, revisions. And one of the big things I did wrong when I initially wrote my first draft is I mixed a lot of my tenses between present and past tense. But one of the things that works for me when I'm doing this first draft writing is I don't want to be interrupted with editing. I think you have to let the story in your head unfold itself as you're going. Don't worry about the mechanics of it, how good the sentence structure is yet, or anything like that. Just put the words down on paper. And of course I typed it. Let the story carry you on. Let the story carry itself through to a conclusion. Now, when I sat down and wrote this, I did not have an outline for the story. I didn't know what was going to happen. I really only had an initial idea of how it started, where the character is concealing her hand unit, which is the terminology for what we would call a cell phone. She was concealing it in a foil pouch in an alley, shielding it from RF energy. And then she was going to go meet some people at a coffee shop, Loser's Blend coffee shop. That's how the story started, but I didn't know anything else of where it would happen. The story simply unfolded itself as I wrote it. What motivates her? She goes to this meeting, something happens, she leaves, what next? Well, she goes to get her phone, what next? Well, she works for the rest of the week until she has to have another meeting. And, well, where does she work? What does she do? Well, there's an opportunity to explain the background of the character, where she came from. In order to make this character three-dimensional, you have to explain their background. Who is she? How did she grow up? Where did she grow up? How did she get into this situation? What are some of the things that have happened in her life that would make you care about her as a character? And those kind of things are an opportunity to explain the background situation. Anyways, the story just unfolded to a point where I was able to come to a conclusion, okay, and that was the first draft. Okay, then the second draft. So I sat down at a different typewriter. In fact, which one was this? I don't even remember what typewriter this was. And I retyped the first draft, taking into account the corrections, the spelling and context and grammar and all that stuff, and some changes I had done. And it gave me an opportunity to kind of polish the sentence structure and make it read a little bit more, let it flow better and all that. And then when I got done with that second draft, I sat on it for a couple of days, and then I sat down and started to go over it again and see if there's any issues I needed to explain. And in this case, I realized that there was a ending scenario that I had written in there that I really needed to explain more about. So I had to go back and add in this one scene a little bit more dialogue that explains what's going on. From there, I sat down and actually started to actually type a prototype of the finished piece. And what I mean by that is formatted at the size of 4 inches by 7 inches that Richard Polt requires. And what I did for that is I took a backing sheet of paper and I drew in dark ink the 4 by 7 inch border centered on my backing sheet of paper, so that when I put my typing paper in front of it, you can kind of see the outline of the lines there, right? And it gives you a guideline for typing. And that was really super crucial to getting the typing to fit within that size. Now, typing this so-called finished draft, or at least a prototype of it, I might retype it again. Typing it is different than brainstorm writing. Typing this is like operating a printing press. Every letter has to be typed slowly, accurately, with a good dark imprint. And you have to make sure you know where you're at in terms of copying over the draft you're copying from, which is one of the reasons why when I was working from the draft copy, the second draft, I was marking in pencil every time I would finish a paragraph so I could know where I started off at. I didn't want to accidentally start at the wrong line and have to either erase an entire line with correction tape or start over the sheet. So I had to make sure that I knew where I was at when I was typing it. Also, just a little thing at the very start of your piece, the formatting, Mr. Polt requires the title of the story to be 2 lines down from the top, centered, and then your name to be centered 1 or 2 lines further. So to do the centering of it, I actually had to sit there, write out the name, the words, count how many of the letters, and figure out what the center point of the letter is. Type the center point in the middle of the paper between the margins, type that, and then go backspace to the beginning and type those. So it's centering both of those so they're center justified as he required. And from there, it was just a mechanical thing about very accurately making sure it's all typed fine, no typos. If you're going to correct something, make sure you use some correction tape and know how to use it nice and cleanly, etc., etc. And make sure your ribbon is nice and clean and dark, and the type slugs are clean and they're not messy and all that. So I had decided to write this prototype of my finished piece in a 10 character per inch pica typeface machine. And the machine happened to have a blue ribbon. I didn't see actually anything in the rules about the color of ribbon, so I typed it on a blue ribbon machine, a machine already with a blue ribbon in there, nice and fresh ribbon. But I did notice, though, the problem with pica is that your right-hand margin is going to have a lot of spaces in it, because long words, just if you don't want to truncate the word with a hyphen, you're going to have to leave a lot of room, a lot of space, and start the word at the next line. Or you're going to end up hyphenating a bunch of words on the right margin, which I don't like the look of personally. So the other alternative is to use a 12 character per inch machine. And I just may, before I actually submit this to Richard Polt, I may actually retype it on a 12 character per inch machine just to see what it looks like. It'll certainly be fewer pages. My particular story in pica typeface goes 10.5 pages, so I might get it down to, who knows, 8 pages or so if I do it in elite 12 character per inch font. But that's kind of my process right now. It's informed by past writing that I've done. In fact, I'm incorporating some of the elements of the previous world that I've written into this story. It's important that you create a world, a backstory for what's happened, and try to explain as much about that world as possible before you actually start writing, before you even create your character. Once you've done that, then think about the character. The character is really important. It has to be a person that we care about. And you have to flesh out the backstory, the history of that person, what happened, how they're feeling. You have to get into their emotions, what motivates them, etc., etc. So just a few little tips and hints about writing this cold hard type project, crowdsourced from the typewriter community, written on typewriters. Isn't that exciting? Well, until next time, you guys have yourselves a great day.